Good morning, everyone, and what a journey it has been. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share in the findings in our research process. This 7-8 month journey with the communications team that have looked at how government and the media sector as a whole have approached COVID-19 communications to mobilize South African citizens. Um, so my name is Martina. I'm a PhD student. I played a role in convening this chapter, and I was very fortunate to persuade my supervisor and head of the Rhodes Journalism and Media Studies Department School at Rhodes University, Professor Anthea Garman, to join this project with the whole research team there to be able to bring a communication science and media studies scholarly lens to this particular chapter. And then, so amongst those team members were just these are the correct designations. So Professor Garman, who's head of the school. We were also joined by Professor Mansai Diale, who's the NRF Saki Chair in Clean and Green Energy at the University of Pretoria. We were also joined by Professor Francis Hyra, who's the head of the department at the Public Health Faculty of Health Sciences at the Walter Sisulu University. And then Dr. Theodora Aginteti, Tandeka Bukula, Tandi Bombi, and I are all part of Professor Garman's research project as PhD students and postdoctoral. And then Pamela Hulser is a PhD scholar at the University of Stellenbosch, and Dr. Letty Klein is a senior researcher at the University of Pretoria. And these are the researchers behind the research work that we did. At this point, I also want to acknowledge that the late Minister Jackson Mthembu was both kind of the initiator of this actual whole country report, but in particular would have had an interest in this chapter, given his role and the presidency's role in managing some of the critical government communications entities that perform a communication service for between government and South Africa's citizenry. So what we were looking at is the entities that report to the presidency, the entities that are part of the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies, and as well as other statutory entities, for example, the SABC and the MDDA, which have their own acts, their own governance arrangements, but all kind of form part of the kaleidoscope of government communications and public communications in South Africa. So we were looking as researchers, as a research team, we were looking at the working relationship between government communications at a national, provincial, district, and local level, but also at how these various media entities interacted with each other, with the public media, with community media, and with, very importantly, also with private media. And how relationships with organized civil society and other public interest groups impacted and augmented the work that government was doing during the health crisis. And there were particular themes that were cross-cutting for this particular report, and we were looking at the impact of the multilingual nature of South African society, as well as the digital divide, and how those two areas impacted on the communications rollout for COVID-19, which was there to effect behavior change. So the policy framework for the research, obviously the South African Constitution was foremost, and it gives a framework for how transparency must be fostered by providing the public with timely and accurate information. Drawing from that, we also had a look at government communication policy, which was adopted by Cabinet in 2018. We also looked at the principles of health risk communications and developmental communications. So those were the overarching policy frameworks. What documentation did we look at as a research group? We looked at obviously all the relevant communications guidelines emerging from WHO, UNICEF, the AU. We also further looked at all the COVID related planning that were APP's reports that were submitted to Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Communications, particularly looking at GCIS, DCDT, the MDDA, Department of Health, Brand South Africa, and the SABC, which are all of whom are entities who do report to Parliament. We also looked at the series of very rich and interesting research reports and policy reports emerging from SANEF and such bodies. We reviewed the acts and regulations that were passed in relation to COVID, and so forth. And we also had a look, obviously, at the official government website and social media accounts. And GCIS was very generous to provide us with portfolios of published works as well. Who did we speak to? So that was the first layer of research. Who did we speak to? So in communications, we 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 felt the need to speak directly as a research team to all these organizations and entities. So from the AU, where we discussed the issues of how COVID impacts the African Union and South Africa from the level of reputation and the way that the global media constructs a narrative. With GCIS, we had rich engagements and inputs from GCIS around, some of the challenges as well as the successes and learnings from the 2020 communications strategy that they rolled out, which was unprecedented in scale. Um, with the MDDA, we looked at what the MDDA did as response mechanisms to support the community media sector. With COVID South Africa, an interesting civil society initiative to augment communications. We spoke to them about the rationale and what they wanted to say to government around communications and where it can be augmented, and so forth. So we spoke to Brand South Africa. We spoke to the South African Language Board, just to try and understand from that perspective how language plays a role in government communications. We spoke to a range of Eastern and Western Cape activist, community-based activist organizations, representatives to just get a sense of the experience, although this research report doesn't pretend to have been deeply rooted at a community level, because there just wasn't the capacity and the time for that. At the same time, we did get some kind of mediated feedback from civil society organizations. We had interesting conversations with media players such as SANEF and Spotlight, which is a specialist digital publication that looks primarily at public health in South Africa. We had an interesting, lively conversation with Scientist Collective, and then a very insightful engagement with the head of the SABC, who then kindly supplied us with a very interesting market intelligence report, which is one of the annexures to this report that will be published on the website, and which provides you a real sense of the huge audience that the SABC represents and reaches, and how important that SABC is to the country's public health communication, to any public health communication strategy. Okay, then we looked at the regulatory context, and I'll go quickly through this, but essentially government very prescribed regulations to broadcasters and ISPs, internet service providers, to zero rate websites, to broadcast public information in all local languages, including sign languages, around the issue of COVID-19. Every website that was registered as a South African website officially, the ZADNA top level domain name, needed to carry the coronavirus website link. The regulations provided for the zero rating of websites around health and education. And yes, the net effect of these regulations from where we're sitting as researchers, that it led to an unprecedented increase in both the digital and broadcast footprint of the South African digital public sphere. And if you read the report and you have a look at the SABC's market intelligence report, you'll see how audiences responded and spiked, according to kind of the various lockdown scenarios and so forth, and its impact on programming. This is just a quick graph that demonstrates the particular period of time the research team were looking at, from January through to July last year, although we did then take a look at 2020 as a whole. And then quickly, in conclusion, in summary, the chapter and the researchers reaffirm the constitutional mandate, which places an obligation on government to communicate, and which really, the way it does it, underpins the ongoing legitimacy of government, especially during a national emergency and disaster. So the way government communicates is directly linked to its level of legitimacy in citizens' experiences. The research report highlights the relevance of the development communications approach, urges the South African government to fast track the approval and implementation of initiatives and policies designed to address the digital divide. This is a very important point, which I'll go into a little bit more in detail shortly. Motivates for the urgent prioritization of digitally accessible multilingual communications with a citizen feedback loop that is both transparent and responsive. And it's the citizen feedback loop that GCIS and other government organizations need to have a look at. Um, and then identifies the cost of data and cell phone network coverage as ongoing obstacles to citizens' access to the internet. We support the move to enable access to zero-rated websites for education and health and other public interest matters as a public good. But we worry that it's not going to be continued post the lockdown period. The research report in principle recognizes the precedent set by the private news media during the hard lockdown and ongoing to publish, to make free all content related to and reportage related to COVID pandemic. So treating certain kinds of information as a public good. And this is linked to the rise in this notion of what is public interest journalism and the engagements with SANIF and government around creating a more sustainable media sector. The research reports also points to the need to continue to understand South Africa as a highly kind of complex communication space in which new media, digital technology platforms exist alongside, our loud hailers and posters and GCIS officials in cars driving through a community, which I know is something that happens and is part of it, but we need to refine our approach. So on the theme of the communications approach, which is a broad category of specific recommendations, overall, we felt that a humanitarian overtone communications approach as a first resort is preferred to the more security-driven approach, which was implemented during the lockdown, in which the military and the police and structures like NAT joints, which are security structures, kind of lead what is actually, in our view, a humanitarian crisis. It's not a security crisis. And although the security sector has an important role to play in the logistics and it's just the tone of the way the state relates with citizens. We felt you would need to look at that approach rather. We also encourage an approach which emphasizes public health communications principles and which uses African storytelling techniques to customize generic public health messaging for diverse South African citizenship. We further recommend an approach that uses integrated communications practice, and I suspect there'll be a bit of debate around this amongst communicators, but rather than the segmented approach, which sees, for example, social media as a primarily English speaking space. And community radio can be used for multilingualism. What we're encouraging as communications researchers is the recognition of Black Twitter, the South African Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook communities as very direct interlocutors with the potential to breach the rural-urban divide, the digital divide, and be advocates for the circulation of bona fide public health information to communities at large. So that, coupled with the fact that it's in principle a good idea to promote multilingualisms, we'd obviously like to see government platforms, government communication platforms, publishing multilingually. Right, and citizens should be encouraged to, for example, at the moment with the online vaccine registration drive, that should be the main message: get your elders registered, help bridge that digital divide. That's a great campaign, and that can be done multilingually online, and it would have an interesting impact. Right. We also urge the cultivation and maintenance of stakeholder relationships. So the whole private, public, community, and government media relationships need to be strengthened in the context of public health and education campaigns. So the SABC, for example, wasn't included in some of the broader stakeholder planning meetings GCIS hosted, or that seemed to be there seemed to be a high level of not enough planning, at least from what the SABC fed back to us. And so those are the kinds of things that can improve organization, like consolidation of critical sharing of messaging. Okay, the wealth of knowledge in universities, NGOs, civil society can be better leveraged. So recognizing right from the outset social partner networks, and working cooperatively with coalitions and networks as they emerge. There is a presidential committee, I believe, that has been established or is in the process of being established, which looks at how to find sustainable solutions for the media sector as a whole. It's not just the community media sector that faces sustainability issues, but the private media. And there's a number of factors for that, including the multinational tech company monopolies of advertising spend and the changing patterns of consumption of media, not to mention, the direct economic impacts the pandemic had on the big four at the level of publishing printed publications, which are on the decline. So on a number of levels, the media sector is facing a challenge. Right. So digital access, the key points here are around the fact that there's been great policies, but they haven't been implemented. So the clarion call here is for those policies, the white papers that are circulating, to be implemented to ensure that infrastructure is rolled out and the pricing, and that Parliament needs to play is critical in its role to oversight ICASA and push for the necessary policy approvals. Capacitating government communications, this is GCIS, growing the cadre of new government communicators who embed communications work within broader civil society. National Treasury, and we're hoping this research report's a contribution to that broader understanding of National Treasury and DPME, looking at the role of GCIS as the media planning and buying department, and the governance and the planning around that for national health emergencies. GCIS is well placed to do that. However, yeah, there needs to be a closer look at how all of that works and how other government departments cooperate with GCIS around the media buying function, not just in relation to COVID, but all public information messaging. The 11 languages, so GCIS needs to boost its capacity to publish, translate important messaging in all 11 languages. It's important. We can't stress this enough. Um, the SABC's funding model came up as a big issue. The funding of its public health mandate vis-a-vis the real net effect of its schedule being interrupted because of COVID content, thus affecting its already fragile bottom line. These kinds of issues need to be looked at because the SABC is critical. We can't afford for the SABC to fail in its mandate. The South African Language Board's working relationship with government departments need to be improved. There needs to be a look at the inclusion of deaf learners in particular, but just generally the use of the practical application of the multilingual policy needs to be looked at because government has to lead on that. Okay, funding, community media sector needs to be enabled. It's such an important stakeholder for the relatability of the messenger at a local level. So more funding grants to enable public health content, and then as part of the broader conversation around creating an enabling environment for the community media. So the same goes for the public, for the private media. So the private media have an important role to play. There is this committee that's been brokered between the presidency and Senate to look at areas of sustainability. There have been a number of proposals that have been put together, policy recommendations. Um, yeah, and there's various options on the table, including the setting up of a particular agency to fund public interest journalism. We already have the MDDA there as a vehicle. So one needs at a high level, one needs to look at how this agency grows and it plays a role in, but it's not the only vehicle for enhancing media sustainability in the country. And a strong, healthy media equals a strong, healthy, empowered citizenry that are able to respond quickly to the challenges that pandemics and other national emergencies pose to the citizenry of South Africa. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.